afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. Great to have you with us for our last major event of the Center for Integral Ecology for the semester. So pleased to have Dr. Shephard from Ave Maria University with us. So my co-director, Dr. Bagayong, is here in the front row. I'm Dr. Matt Ramage in the Theology Department. And just a brief word about the Center for Integral Ecology. If you've not heard about it, we're dedicated to doing care for creation from an authentically Catholic point of view, to care for both creation and the most vulnerable humans within it. It's actually an enterprise that's not done a lot, so it's really beautiful, pretty beautiful mission. We have a minor in environmental studies that she and I advise. Actually, right now, the courses for the spring for that minor are full, but we have a theology of the environment, environmental science, a lot of great stuff, so be on the lookout for that. We hold periodic events such as this. And for students interested in the Eco-Stewardship Club, any of you guys in the room, talk to those people, a good student club associated with our center.
Okay, did I cover all? Whoa. Did I say what you guys supposed to say?
Yeah. Sign up sheet.
I know how to talk. Can you hear me in the back? Anyway, here it goes. So I want to say a few words welcoming Dr. Shephard. It's still going. This is not going to record very well for whoever's recording this. But anyway, Dr. Shephard hails from the Isle of Skye in the Scottish Highlands and is currently Associate Professor at my PhD alma mater, Ave Maria. At that noble institution, he directs a program somewhat similar to our very own. They have a minor in environmental studies, which focuses on agriculture and Catholic environmental stewardship. Connected with this venture, he has developed and runs the new Ave Maria Farm and Garden. A brief word of personal interest. Having lived in South Florida, I have a deep affection and nostalgia for all the flora and fauna in that part of our great nation. I wish I could grow oranges here like you can. I do wish I could see more alligators. However, I'm not upset that I don't have to worry about being eaten when I bend over to pick a weed. On the more positive side, just last night, Dr. Shephard was telling me that when he gardens, he digs up fossilized, mammoth-sized oysters in the ground. I'm a little jealous of that. Here, however, you can find seashells, 300-million-year-old seashells, if you know where to look. And no, I'm not going to tell you where to look because I want to find them myself. But back to Dr. Shephard. His work is grounded in a situated anthropology based on outdoor tasks such as sustainable fishing and farming that embed practitioners in nature and shape environmental stewardship. He is concerned with embedded and sensory encounters with natural places, the recovery of experience. In this connection, his popular writing links sustainability science to outdoor practice and Catholic environmental stewardship, and he enjoys discussing topics related to environmental stewardship, especially the boundaries of sustainability science, ethics, and theology, both among Catholic audiences and in the broader public conversation. If you end up interested in reading any more of his scientific papers or knowing more about his ventures, check out his website, Samuel Shephard, SHEPHARD.com. But for now, though, we have him present in the flesh, so it's my pleasure to offer us to give a warm welcome for Dr. Shephard in his lecture, Place, Practice, and Person in Environmental Stewardship, How to Embed Yourself in Reality.
Hello everyone, can you hear me okay now? Yeah, great. So, it's lovely to be here. I've been hearing about Benedictine College for a long time. Cool people, cool things happening. It seems to be true, more or less, I'm having a great visit. So I was talking to Dr. Ramage about this topic. And we agreed more or less that I would talk about environmental stewardship. He said rather perceptively, well, we know quite a lot about the theology, so why don't you talk about the science? Which was judicious, because my theology is at best rather pathetically amateurish. But I do think perhaps I can give you some scientific insight which will complement the kind of thing that he and others talk about, which I hope will introduce a fruitful dialogue. So I'm going to talk about this, person, people, physical pathway by which a person can attain to becoming a good steward of the created order. So specifically I'm going to talk about the starting point in environmental impacts. For better or worse, we are very conscious of what humans are doing to the world. We're inevitably concupiscent, we tend to mess up, and so our start is what we see that we're doing to creation. I'm going to recognise then that this is, or environmental issues, basically are fundamentally anthropological. The starting point doesn't necessarily, is not necessarily placed in identifying specific impacts and parameterising the scientific and engineering solutions. It's more about perhaps recognising who we are, what it is to be human, what nature is, and how this human-non-human dynamic is represented. That's what we have to deal with first, and then we can act specifically. And I'm going to propose these two ways of specifying that human-on-human relationship. First of all, what sustainability scientists refer to as relational thinking, and then so-called dwelling. So both of these are ways of representing our being in the world, essentially. And they're going to talk about this pathway to environmental stewardship, rendered in the mode of environmental virtue, which is essentially about virtue ethics, an Aristotelian way of thinking, because I think this captures very nicely what it is to get from practice, from your habits, your practical habits, to a right orientation. I'm going to talk about sense of place and identity, and then care. Care is a really broad topic in sustainability science and its kind of associated disciplines. What motivates us? Some people think of care as a motivation, other people as an act and dialogue with nature. I'll just touch at the end on agency, this necessity to actually be unleashed, to have the capacity and the situation in which we can act. And then for all of this is this idea of how to embed yourself in the world. I think that care for nature operates from within the system itself. So I hope in our conversation we can deal more explicitly with this and get a bit more whimsical or theoretical or something. My talk has this as an implicit dimension, but I think this is what we really need to talk about. Okay, so to start, environmental harm, which is not very uplifting, but this is the reality. And anthropogenic impacts on the world operate at two scales, basically, don't they? We have these high-level issues, climate change, the hole in the ozone layer, other stuff which functions basically at planetary scale. And the Sustainability Institute, or the Stockholm Sustainability Institute in Sweden, for example, periodically conducts these assessments of how humans are doing with regard to what they call planetary boundaries. So they've identified as indicators of planetary state, basically, which are about clean air and soil and water, because it's a function of biodiversity and so on. And they say, really, how are we doing with this living system, this Earth living system? And inevitably, and rather depressingly, they tell us over and over again that we're basically exceeding carrying capacity, the limits of these planetary boundaries to deal with this. So, starting point one, we can't keep what we're doing. We can't keep doing what we're doing. If we persist with business as usual, we will break the planet. So, that's nice, isn't it? Good starting point. The trouble with that is, and this is what I always find difficult, I find the idea of the planet actually a bit abstract. We know in theory we're spinning through space, don't we? This blue jewel is the whole universe, and 13.6 billion years old and all that sort of thing, but I kind of can't get my head around it. And I think this is a problem that a lot of people find. You just feel so intractable, you feel so helpless. And I know a lot of young people get really depressed about this. I remember when I was about 13 years old, and as Dr. Ramage said, I was brought up in this largely in this very remote part of the north of Scotland, but I remember carrying on my little thin shoulders the weight of the Brazilian Amazon rainforest, something like that. It's just completely out with your capacity to do anything about it. Okay, so global issues, but then also, and much more attractively, and I think this is where our starting point is, we also see actually kind of painful environmental harm in the places that are very local to us, and places we really care about. And the older you get, the more you're likely to encounter this. So now I'm years old, but I've fished, for example, in the same lake for 40 years. But I see there aren't so many fish as there used to be. Or maybe there are, but the whole community is completely different. Or the beach that you go to, which used to have 3 people on it and no trash, now has 500 people on it and it's crap everywhere. Right? This sort of thing is absolutely unavoidable, and it's tangled up really with our perceptions of our childhood, or our perceptions of where we're from and all this sort of thing. So, global and local, and really uncomfortable. And then finally, of course, the environment is just so conversation, isn't it? Look at the news every day, what do you see? Well, the economy is a disaster. Everything's going bad, so strictly avoiding the expletive. And there's the environment, right? Climate change is all falling apart. For better or worse, we've just had this election here, haven't we? We've seen how environmental issues are ridiculously passed out across these two really unattractive political ends of the spectrum, which is pretty hopeless. But the point is that the environment's actually unavoidable. Here it is, we've got to deal with it. So what are we going to do? Well, I think first of all, we need to ask, what do we think about this? What's our primary response to this? I think for a lot of people, I think the 13-year-old me in the rainforest is just to say, well, is there anything left? Have we broken it? Or what, is there anywhere out there which is still wild and free and beautiful? I don't even need to go there. I just need to know that there's somewhere where humans haven't broken it, or soiled it, or sullied it in some way. I think this is the intuition of a lot of people. And it basically comes down to, or as a function of this idea that humans are the problem, isn't it? Humans are the problem, humans are broken. The logical response, and it's an impeccable logic, is get rid of humans. So what happens with that? Well, we see that in two very persistent, high-level policy responses to the environment, which have been around at least since the 50s or 60s. Well, the first one is, of course, population control, right? Humans are a problem, let's get rid of humans, we'll have less babies. What's really interesting about this already, and I've been working, I guess, in this field for 25 years now, I see that the population control narrative seems to be diminishing. It's not nearly as prevalent as it used to be. There's still the same people who go on about it, but I think it's not the primary recourse of people thinking about public human dealing with humans authority. So that's one way to go. The second way is, of course, kind of human retreat, is to institute really vast closed areas around the world, places where human use of human activity is substantially constrained. So the really big example at the moment is the Convention for Biological Diversity, which you may have come across. It's pretty much a global accord, actually. I think every country in the world has signed to it, apart from one, which is the case. But their high-level strategy for CBD at the moment is what they call their 30 by 30 program. So they're proposing by the year 2030, 30% of the surface of the planet, land, sea, and fresh water, will be have substantially limited human activity, 30%. And then 10% of the whole surface of the planet will have very, very limited human consumptive use. So it's a different strategy, but the logic is the same. Humans are the problem, so the humans will in some way retreat from nature and then leave these unpeopled wilderness, essentially. Now, this sounds great. The trouble is, though, is this intuition that many of us have, which is that, okay, humans probably are the problem, right? Pretty much, that's how everyone we do this stuff. And then we have to try to resolve it. So maybe we are the problem, but also the solution. And maybe actually, somehow, we have a really explicit responsibility to take responsibility and resolve some of these situations, or try and work out a better mode of dealing with the environment, which is by definition sustainable and perhaps is actually recuperative in some way. So maybe it's not just humans breaking nature and then retreating, it's that we're actually part of the system and we have to do something about it. Okay, so where does that leave you? Well, it leaves you straight away with these really difficult existential questions. As I mentioned a minute ago, thinking about the environment is not really an engineering process, at least it's not first an engineering process. All the scientific disciplines, which get involved with ecology and whatever, are about specifying problems and solutions. But prior to that, you have to think about these much more philosophical questions, like, well, are we the problem or the solution? And I think fundamentally,
He's trying to resync. I think it'll turn off.
Let's try.
isn't technical, it's basically anthropological. It's about rightly specifying what a human is, how a human is, what nature is, how this human-non-human dynamic plays out. And John II referred to this as inadequate anthropology. He says we have to rightly frame this dynamic. We have to have an anthropology which is sufficiently robust and flexible and broad enough that it actually has the capacity to provide us with a platform from which we can appropriately deal with the natural nature of stewardship. The point is, of course, that how you think about the human person will then fundamentally shape how you respond to pretty much everything you do. And abortion is another question. How you think about that, and really passionately and with a great deal of intellectual integrity in either direction, basically follows what we think a human is. It's the same with how we deal with this broader aspect of creation. So I think it's worth just considering very briefly or caricaturing for a moment the options that would give us a starting point. Now, these are totally inadequate, but basically the suggestion is that we have this gradient of anthropologies from anthropocentric to ecocentric. I'm sure you know what this is, but basically anthropocentric deals with anthropology of the human person, and it places humans right in the middle, such that everything else is for the good, for the utility of humans. It's just stuff that we can use. So has anyone played Minecraft? Yeah, Minecraft is kind of exemplary anthropocentrism. Basically, you turn on this computer program, and you're given a world, a completely flat, passive landscape, and it's populated with stuff, like vegetables and minerals and tools and rocks and everything. And that has no inherent character at all. You basically download your a priori ideas of reality onto this passive landscape. And you use it all for you to kind of project yourself into the world. That's, I think, pretty often Now, the other end of the spectrum is ecocentrism, which is quite nicely and legitimately opposite. Ecocentrism says instead that humans are just a node in the food web, basically. This complex predator-prey competitive relationships. We're just one species among many, such that we are literally no more important than a newt or scum or phytoplankton or something like that. In physical terms, we're just a bin of energy, right, in this massive process of energetic transfer. It's a completely flat spectrum. Now, I don't think anyone actually, at least no idea, I don't know if anyone really believes in either of these extremes in their pure sense. I think, as usual, what we tend to end up with is totally logically incoherent middle, which are bits of that and this, which we kind of lash together and operate from. But it's nice to understand where this stuff comes from. Of course, both of them are completely problematic. Really, see what happens with Minecraft. Anthropocentrism has this tendency to diminish nature from something which might have intrinsic value and beauty and meaning just into stuff that we use, and if we use it, we're highly likely, and we are seen to overuse it. And then ecocentrism, conversely, I think forefronts the nature and thus incentivizes to look after it, but it gives us no platform, by definition, from which we can then act. If we're just one species among many, if we have no unique traits or authority or dignity, then we have nowhere to act from. We can't assume responsibility, even really charitable responsibility, to look after the rest of the world. So then one species, we have this tendency to elevate other species, which are just as good or better than ours. It's very easy if you think that humans are just one species and not a very good species, to say, well, dolphins are better, for example. I think you could make a reasonable argument for that. So, where does that leave you? What I want to talk about now is a couple of framings of anthropology, human dynamics, which I think head towards quite nicely an adequate version of this. So the first one emerged in sustainability science, say from the 2010s on, and it's this idea of relational values. It basically says that what matters is not the stuff you're dealing with so much, which is this object, but more the relationships that humans have with components of nature. So it says that more like humans and non-human components of nature develop these basically reciprocal relationships, and what really matters is that relationship unto itself. And what I really like about that is it kind of captures, I think, how I experience nature. I definitely care about a tree, and it's hard to say you have a reciprocal relationship with it, but certainly your feeling about it is somehow structured by it. It's not just completely imposed by you. Nature has some form, and that reflects how you think about it. But the other thing I think is really important is that this relationality immediately and necessarily grounds you in your body, in your physical experience, because how you encounter nature is multisensory. Right? You touch it, you smell it, you hear it, you feel it, see it. Right? So then your activities, as soon as you're a body, what you do with your body, your practical activities, then are immediately linked into the system, grounded in place and in tasks, and what you do then propagates through the system in a meaningful way. And also you become part of this relationality which can really shape what you think about the world, and about yourself, and about any possible spiritual dimensions the system might have. So that's relationality. It's fundamentally about relationship. The unit of meaning is relationship rather than subject object. Now, I really like that relationality, but it was kind of anticipated quite a lot, well, much longer than that, really during the 90s and earlier, with this dwelling, so-called dwelling perspective. So the person who developed this, I think, most significantly is a British anthropologist called Tim Ingold. He was head of the anthropology department at the University of Aberdeen for a long time. And he was thinking about, well, this kind of pre-version of relationality. And he started with Minecraft, basically, or this kind of vision. He said, okay, what happens then is there are humans plonked down in a landscape, and then they just do what it is that humans do. So it doesn't matter where it is, the tundra or the rainforest or the jungle or whatever, or the mountains, and they see what they can see, and they collect food, and they build stuff, and they go about their different life ways, pretty much independent of what they are, except they're constrained, they will survey them. But then he thought, well, that's not really actually how it is at all, is it? And, well, in honor of Dr. Baxter, who's here, imagine, I don't know, an Italian village somewhere rural. And you look around, and you see almost immediately that it really isn't Minecrafty. The architecture, and the food, and the cycles of the agricultural year, perhaps possibly even the dialect, the way people look, their festivals, have obviously actually emerged from the system in this kind of co-constitutive process, right? They're a reflection of the geology, of the climate, and of what grows there, and of what you can build out of. And also, this is really important, a kind of temporality, because time is involved with this. Things are slowly aggregating over time in this kind of flow, this dynamic between person and place. So the human initiates something, but what they can actually do and how they can do it is constrained by the self, by what's available, by what the ecosystem looks like, and what you can do. So this is how the dialogue works, basically. So Ingold then said, well, it's not really a landscape. It's not this kind of passive platform where you play out your life. It's actually like humans moving through the cycles of the agricultural year, or the cycles of their lives, or moving from where the seeds are stored, to where you cook, to where you eat, to where you worship. Lay down these physical pathways across the landscape. And they have signposts. This is where you go at this time of year. And imagine all of this is rendered in time, such that you go around these practical cycles, you follow these physical pathways through time. But he said on top of that, then, there are these kind of meta pathways which are laid down by your spiritual practices, which are also deeply embedded in these practical processes. So at seed time, you find it is Easter, and then harvest time is, whatever happens then, Halloween, and then Christmas follows. And so there's this kind of sequential layers of tasks and pathways which are laid down and become the taskscape, basically. So it's not this dualism of human and landscape, it's actually a kind of dialogue process. And he told, he's an anthropologist, so he's a lot of freedom, not being a technical scientist, about the language he can use, but he loved this idea of, we talked about this sort of thing, constitutive acts of dwelling, how it is that person, place, and task work together to create the taskscape. So, where does that leave you in the talk on stewardship? I think you can see, basically, so I'm going to open my logo. Classic American motivational. My logo says failure is always an option. Okay, so you can imagine yourself being grounded in this taskscape, and what happens? Well, inevitably now person and place and these pathways all become tangled up together. You're aware of where you've come from, who you're moving with, and you're intent on where you're going, which basically is the beginning of stewardship. You start to think about what you need to do to make sure you can sustain the system into the future, and inevitably, really that's the beginning of care for the natural world, which is what stewardship is. So what I want to talk about now is how it is that in these relatively intact dwelling systems or relational social ecological systems, the individual can follow a pathway by which they can attain to care and active care from the system of stewardship. And I think this is really worth asking, at least for utilitarian reasons, because once we know how someone can become a good steward, we can perhaps reproduce that in most of the ways we live, or the places we live, which are far more synthetic, of course, than a traditional medieval context. So, the first question is, what is stewardship? Which turns out to be quite difficult. I've been doing a bit of work recently in which we realise that it's very easy to equivocate quite seriously. Everyone thinks they know what stewardship is, but we render our definition based on lots of all sorts of preconceptions of what we think about the world of our anthropologists and so on. But I do like this definition, which is from F.S. Chapman, who's a very influential sustainability scientist, and a group of other people writing in 2010. And there's a few dimensions. I'm just going to point it forward. There's a few dimensions that I wanted to highlight on this. The first one is that it's about responsible use. So stewardship is not a retreat mode of existing. It's about use. It's legitimate in this system to use the goods of nature in some way. Okay, so you're embodied and you're using. Use and protection of the natural environment through conservation and sustainable practices. This is really significant. So how do you go about your responsible use? Well, you go about it by doing things, by operating through practical tasks which are in themselves functions such that future generations will be able to use nature in the same way. This again. Okay, so sustainable practices. And then to enhance ecosystem resilience and human well-being. The point being that here you are acting, you're operating, you're conducting these practical tasks in a way which is basically oriented towards some social ecological good. So responsible use through embodied practical sustainable practices and oriented towards human and ecological well-being. The point is, and I'm sure you recognise this, once you start using this kind of language about practice and right orientation and so on, it's very easy to get into virtue ethics mode of thinking in this case. There's Mr. Aristotle with his beauty. Imagine here environmental virtue, something like from sustainable practices, doing the right thing at the right time, with the right emotional state, with some orientation towards the common good, right? So we talk about sustainable practices, and this is sustainability scientists often rendering this way. Sustainable practices oriented towards social ecological flourishing. Here, I think virtue ethics gives this same kind of way of thinking about good habits, good practical outdoor habits, which lead you in the right direction. We're thinking here about sustainable practices in which attaining excellence is really difficult. So it's not like horse riding or sword fighting or something, but I don't know, carpentry or growing a farm or something like that, where you have to take time, you have to strive for excellence, and that yields this kind of muscle memory, this kind of right mode of operation. And what comes with that is corollary moral virtues, like temperance, for example, which are obviously very relevant to care for the environment. How many fish should we take, how many mushrooms should we pick, how many trees should we cut down, and so on. So practitioners in these systems need to become oriented towards common good. So what I'm going to give now then is what I see as a fairly logical process by which the individual can get from some starting point through to being empowered and unleashed as a good steward. And I say, this picture is from a recent paper about basically how hunting is a good example of one of these outdoor practices. But I said, first of all, stewardship starts in nature experience, because you can only love what you know, basically. So then the question is, how do you get to know natural systems such that you can fall in love with them? And I think the answer is that it cannot be a superficial process at all. It's no good just going somewhere once or twice and looking at it and imagining that you're going to care for it and you're going to know what to do and looking after it. You have to go back to the same places over and over again. Different times of year, multiple years, different types of weather, different types of day, with different people in different moods and life stages you're in. Such that eventually you get to this place where you attain a kind of ecological intuition or anticipation of how the system is going to be structured and function. So, an example I always think of is We lived in a place in Ireland for a while, and behind the house there was quite a lot of acres of plantation forestry. And winding through that was an old dirt track with puddles in it, all winter, with these really cold, mucky puddles, and you walk the kids through there, they get soaking wet and miserable. But in February, mid-February every year, suddenly some of these puddles got a frog in them. It just almost every year was like a miracle. Like this frog that kind of spontaneously manifested itself in the puddle. And then a week later, there's tadpoles and frogs and the whole thing's happening. Or, I don't know, some mossy bank under an oak tree, very English, right, south-facing bank. Most of the summer that will be covered with tall annual grasses and foliage, and it's incredibly beautiful. It's just chaos. But if you're there just before that, in April, it's primroses flowering. Right? These little low, do you have primroses here? These little low green leathery leaves and these amazing pastel yellow flowers. Now if you just go there a couple of times, you'll see the frog and the primroses, but you won't really understand how they fit into this temporality, into this cycle. But once you go there over and over again, you start to know, well, if I go there then, this is how it will be. Now, that's the kind of nature experience I'm talking about, where you have an intuition of how the system's structured and how it functions, how the ecological processes propagate through time. So the next question is, how is the best, what's the best way of attaining this kind of really thorough nature experience? And I think the answer is that you can, here we are, engage in striving for excellence in practical tasks that are intrinsically embedded in a particular place, and tasks for which success, or at least a high level of success, depends on this kind of ecological intuition. So you ask the question, who's going to catch the most fish? In your next go fishing, quite often one person or couple of people always catch more than the others. On average, it's probably because they're better at it, right? They have better muscle skills and a more profound understanding of where the fish are at a given time of year, what they're likely to be eating, where their refuge is, what their predators are, and so on. This is because, in order to succeed, you have to understand the system. You're highly incentivized to understand the system better. Now, the other bit of this is that these kind of practical embodied skills, which yield virtue apparently, can't be kind of downloaded from one person to the next. That's not how cultural transmission works. Every individual has to relearn the next generation. People can help you learn them, but you have to build that muscle memory, you have to build that capacity for yourself. And then there is this temporal flow of skill and insight and knowledge, which kind of accumulates over time, but by being relearned and re-experienced in each generation. Okay, so, nature encounter, through a task, what's the best way of learning a task? Well, I think within a community of wise mentors, within a so-called community of practice. We think about you're striving for excellence here, you're talking about striving for the highest level of excellence yet achieved. I think that's what Master McIntyre says, something like that. You can't do it by yourself. Maybe you fly a fishing rod and some worms, you might catch a couple of fish, or a trowel and some seeds, and you might grow some kind of mangy carrots. But if you're working, if you really want to become excellent, you need the insight. You need people who can slightly reorient your attention, who can point out these little details which you just can't assimilate yourself. It's not possible in the short time you have. You need people who can help you. And then your person and your practice, your task, then becomes integrated into the community, into place, and into this temporal flow, basically. Now, mentors do something else for us, which is they introduce very explicit behavioural norms. This is how you should behave when you're practicing this task in this community, in this place. And with regard to looking after nature, these are pretty obvious, right? Where can you go? When should you go there? What can you kill? How much can you kill? And so on. So what does all this leave you with? It leaves you with habituated practical excellence, which operates in a community with behavioural expectations and really explicitly orienting towards the future of the community and the task and the resource of the place. So it's quite easy then to think about this about the virtues, orientation towards the good, basically. So what happens next? Well, I think inevitably, if you're embedded in this place over time with the people you love, the people who form you, what follows is sense of place, sense of identity. All of this gets deeply entangled up with who you are. This is me, this is who I am, this is where I'm from, this is my place, these are my people, and out of that comes care. And what do you care about? Well, this place, these people, this community, this task. And always going on back to Scotland, but there's Robert Burns, Scottish poet laureate, talking in 1789. He he said, my heart's in the Highlands. My heart isn't here. My heart's in the Highlands, chasing the deer. I imagine him some really boring function in Edinburgh or something like that. He's not there, really. What does he care about? Not that. Somewhere up in the mountains, somewhere with the deer, somewhere you can see across the horizon, the heather and the rock. So I live known for really boring parts of Southwest Florida and I'm campaigned every day by this, right? Where do you care about? It's the place that part of who you are. Okay? So you care about it, what do you want to do? Care, then you want to look after the place. Do you care about it? Okay? So off you go. And stewardship. So there's a little bit then, there's kind of a last piece in the puzzle, is agency. You being kind of empowered and unleashed to do the right thing at the right time. And the first bit of that, I think, is personal agency, which is actually your individual capacity. So it's no good saying, you look after the Missouri River, if you don't know anything about it. You've no way of understanding what's going on, and no idea what might be the right thing to do. The cool thing is, if you're embedded in a task in the community practice, it's highly likely that you do have that ecological intuition. So now you'll have the capacity to assess the ecological state in that lake or something, and you're quite likely to have some good intuition about what will be the appropriate management measure to address a particular problem. So now you are at the engineering stage, right? Who's going to understand and resolve the issue? It's going to be this person. That's personal agency. The other bit is institutional agency. So again, it's no good caring for the system, knowing all about it, knowing exactly what's the right thing to do, but you're totally disempowered by legislation, by your local community, by the government, or something like that. You also have to operate within a context which gives you the authority to act. And it's quite interesting. There's a couple of things to say here. You've probably come across this really gloomy scientist, Garrett Hardin, who talked about the tragedy of the commons, which remember this idea. He basically said in the early 60s, well, you give humans authority to look after some common pool resource, some shared resource, like a forest or a fishery. I think his example was a shared grazing ground. And they always mess it up because they're selfish and stupid. So he was saying, right, imagine this little village, everyone has a couple of cows, a couple of chickens, and a vegetable garden, and a pig, and then they share this common grazing ground. And everyone's allowed to put five say, cows out every year, and the system can support that and everything will be fine. Then one year someone says, oh, I'm going to put 10 cows this year. Sure enough, 10 cows grow big and fat, he makes twice as much money. So the next year everyone says, well, we'll all do 10 cows, and he does 20 cows, and they overgraze, and the whole thing collapses. So that's the tragedy of commons, because there's only one part of agency there. But he was countered, this guy, really in the late 90s by this researcher, Eleanor Ostrom, who was really cool. She's a Nobel Prize winning economist, and she worked a lot with indigenous communities. So through her own empirical research, she was able to say, actually, given a common pool resource like this, a hunting system or something, humans are really good at establishing these cultural norms and practices for sustainability. Which makes sense, doesn't it, really? Because if we were so bad looking after the resources on which we depend, we'd have gone extinct ages ago. So she said, it tends to work out well, but you need these three conditions, or a set of conditions, basically, if you want your system to operate sustainably, if you want to be good stewards. The first one is ownership. It's hard not to think of American politics when we talk about this. But basically, she said the first thing you need is to have effective or de facto ownership of your system. Because you only really invest in something when you're pretty confident that you'll get meaningful good back out of it. Now, secondly, she said that system needs to be bounded, such that to the extent to which you and your family or your community invest in it, there's not going to be other people coming in subsequently and capitalizing on your resource and extracting it from the system such that you lose some of your reward. And then finally, she said you need effective constraints. Basically, you have to be able to prevent cheats, or at least punish cheats onerously without never doing it again. Okay? So this is the conditions. She said, given these conditions, which are incredibly consistent across indigenous socio-ecological systems, then it's likely that stewardship would happen. So, pretty much.
One last miracle. Anyway, you just go. They can hear
Shout
you.
for the last bit.
Yeah. Just shout out. Thank you.
Yeah, so here we have, I've said that stewardship, I think, you basically start with places. So you have place. Stewardship is grounded in place. The community, of course, none of us is independent. This whole idea of self-sufficiency is a myth. We operate within a community which is engaged with practices, sustainable use or responsible use through sustainable practices, which are oriented towards some sort of common good. Out of that comes care about the system, and the knowledge and skills, the insight, the muscle memory, the good habits, which are the structures of sustainable stewardship. And then what follows that is agency. All of this is supported in a kind of multidimensional way by virtue, by this habituated tendency, oriented towards common good. Now, just finally, I look forward to discussing this now, actually. I hope that lots of you will disagree with me fundamentally, but I just wanted to make a little point. Usually at this point, people will ask me very specific questions about specific social ecological questions. What do I do in my lake or my town or the river or whatever? And the trouble is that most of what I've been saying now reveals that actually the insight of what's gone wrong and what's the right thing to do is only available to people in that system. That's the whole point, basically. So I can provide a theoretical framework which you might be able to operate from, and there'll be scientists who provide technical advice, and all sorts of organizations can help you do that. But defining your objectives, understanding changing the social political state, defining objectives and then the right practices, the right things to do,